paper book, by and large, once you give that certificate, that may be accepted by the tribunal. But I think it would be advisable on the whole, as far as additional evidence is concerned, that we give a separate paper book. Of course, the tribunal has got full powers. They can accept additional evidence, they may reject it. It will depend on the facts of each case, and in most cases where the additional evidence has not been considered by the lower authorities, the matter would be sent back to the lower authorities. Now, as far as petitions for stay of demand is concerned, now as somebody mentioned earlier, I think today we are witnessing a whole lot of cases where huge demands are being raised. I think all of us have experienced that in the months leading to 31st March, all of us have been going, and there have been threats of recovery, and we've been filing stay applications and trying to convince the assessing officer regarding our bona fides and why these amounts should be stayed. And that's the reason why we thought that let's talk with some practical perspectives out here. And as we all know, demand would arise only when, in pursuance of an order, a notice under Section 156 is issued. And generally, there's a time limit under Section 220 of up to 30 days, whereby an SSE is required to pay the amount. If he fails to do so, then he will be deemed to be an SSE in default, and that is, and then coercive action is taken. So, if the Act itself, envisages various situations where you can, an SSE can, before a period of 30 days lapses, that you can make an application for the purpose of a prayer for seeking stay of this demand. Now there are broadly two situations. One is that a demand is arising pursuant to an assessment order, and you have filed an appeal before the CITS. So there, the issue is really simple. We can file a stay petition before the assessing officer, then to the higher-ups. We can also file an application to the Commissioner of Appeals, where that appeal has been filed for the Commissioner of Appeals. And here, of course, we cannot approach the tribunal directly because there has been no appeal filed to the tribunal. So the tribunal, certainly in the absence of any appeal filed before it, will not entertain any petition for a stay. And in the second situation, where there has been a final assessment order pursuant to ERP directions, then we certainly can make an application to the tribunal once an appeal has been filed to the tribunal pursuant to the final assessment order. Coming to specifically the proceedings before the assessing officer, broadly, as far as stay petitions are concerned, there will be two main areas, two main authorities before which stay petitions will be urged. One is at the assessment level, the administrative level, and the second is before the tribunal. It's very rarely that a Commissioner of Appeal would adjudicate on a stay application. Here, what we need to consider is that as when we make an application for stay, the most important thing is there needs to be a prima facie case. We have to bring out a prima facie case, and also having regard to Circular 1914. You see, today what the tribunal, what the Central Board of Direct Taxes has done is, there were a host of circulars which were issued in relation to stay of demand. Finally, because there was confusion on the subject, the CBDT finally came out with a circular, a notification stating that Circular number 1914 dated 2nd of December 1993. This is the final circular on the subject, and the guidelines in this circular which will be binding on the assessing officer for determining as to how and in what circumstances will the stay be granted. So first, it's important for us to study this instruction, CBDT instruction 1914. Broadly speaking, what the circular states is that number one, any stay petition needs to be dealt with by the assessing officer or by his higher up within a period of 2 weeks. Within a period of 2 weeks of making the application. Secondly, once you make an application to the assessing officer, let us assume he rejects the stay. You can always approach a higher authority But the circular also states that the higher authority shall interfere only in exceptional circumstances. That is, if it there could be undue hardships, or if there are high-pitched demands. This instruction also gives certain guidelines that a stay can be granted if the dispute has been decided in the SSC's own favor by an appellate authority or by a court, or if there have been conflicting views of various high courts on the subject, or if the jurisdictional high court has got a separate view on the matter and if the department has not accepted that view. So if any of our cases, if any of the additions that have been made in our case fall within these parameters, we can invoke the circular and as a matter of right tell the assessing officer that you are bound to grant me a stay on this issue. Apart from that, the circular also deals with a lot of issues, the powers of the assessing officer to impose certain conditions. The assessing officer can either grant full stay, he can adjust refunds, he has the powers to adjust various refunds which may be due, he can insist on some security, he can also insist on payment of by installments, etc. The second point besides this CBTT instruction that we need to bear in mind is that in view of the fact that there have been a lot of coercive recovery action, recently I think all of us would have read about at least 1 in 10 cases, either the tribunal or the Bombay High Court has been coming out with rulings on a stay of demand. And I think 2 of these decisions are worth noting, KEC International and UTI Mutual Fund. And both are these of the jurisdictional High Court, that's the Bombay High Court. And especially in KEC International, the Bombay High Court has set down clear parameters for the purpose of deciding any stay application. And the parameters are these. Number 1, that in the case of a stay application, the authority needs to set out a case of the SSC briefly. Secondly, they also, in case if the assessing officer feels that some payment needs to be made, then they need to record prima facie reasons why they are insisting on a part payment to be made by the SSC. Third, while doing this also, they should deal with any arguments made regarding financial viability. And lastly, and the most important, that the assessing officer cannot take any coercive actions till such time, the time limit for the purpose of filing an appeal has expired. All these propositions were reiterated in the case of UTI Mutual Fund. There the Bombay High Court went a step further. They said even after the time limit for filing an appeal has expired, there should be some further time limit also given to the SSC for seeking recourse to other legal measures. And in both these cases, there was attachment of accounts, and in the case of UTI Mutual Fund, in fact, the Bombay High Court, passed strictures and told the department to refund the amount which had been recovered. So I think some of these decisions need to be noted, because in case of high-pitched assessment, sometimes one may be forced to approach the High Court directly by way of a writ. And if one relies on these decisions, certainly the High Court would be bound by another decision of the division bench. Apart from that, just 2-3 things as far as stay petition is concerned is that one needs to consider also Rule 35A of the tribunal rules, which deal with the procedure for filing a stay petition. Broadly stated, what the rule states is that when you are filing a stay before the tribunal, you need to bring out the facts of the case, what are the result of the appeal before the Commissioner appeals, what is the total amount of outstanding demand, what is the amount of interest, what's the penalty if any, what was, if you file an appeal before the tribunal, what is the date of filing the appeal number, what was the result of the application filed to the authorities, the reasons for seeking stay, and what is your offer. Meaning you may make a lot of offers, you may make a prayer that the tribunal should grant absolute stay. There could be a prayer that, yes, I'm willing to pay installments. Another prayer could be made that, okay, fine, you adjust the refunds, but grant me an early hearing within a month's time. So these things need to be set out very lucidly. One or two points also which need to be borne in mind is that, as we all know, that though there is no specific time limit for disposing stay petitions by the tribunal, by and large when we file an application before the tribunal, the hearing would be fixed maximum within a week or 2 weeks' time. And in fact, instruction 1914 also very clearly states that, you see, when a stay petition is before the tribunal, the department representative should insist that the matter should be fixed maximum within a month's time, so that eventually when the matter is heard, it can be decided quickly, and if any amount has to be recovered, it can be recovered earlier. Is it necessary that before approaching the tribunal, one needs to file a stay petition before any lower authorities? Earlier there was a lot of debate on this, but then there have been subsequent rulings where the tribunal has held that no, you can, as long as you file an appeal on the main issue to the tribunal, you can approach the tribunal directly for a stay petition, and you need not first approach any revenue authority below. Just quickly, again, as far as stay petitions are concerned before the tribunal, there are various considerations. The most important is a prima facie case. And once the tribunal hears the petition, there are various, the tribunal may give, after hearing the petition, it may either grant full recovery, it may grant full stay, absolute stay, it may decide that you need to pay by installments. They may insist on some security in the form of bank guarantee. They may insist on some early hearing or out of turn hearing. They may insist that stay which was granted earlier may be extended. But of course, as we all know, under 254 2A, the power of granting extension cannot exceed beyond 365 days. Even if any delay in hearing the appeal is attributable to the department and not to the appeal, even then, once 365 days elapses, your stay automatically gets vacated. The tribunal incidentally also has got powers to stay other proceedings. This is quite interesting. For example, now let us say an order under 263 is passed. The commissioner has got powers to revise. So under 263, an order is passed from the commissioner against which there lies a direct appeal to the tribunal. Now what the assessing officer will do is that he will pass an assessment 143.3 led by 263. Now the question is, when the demand arises under the 143 led by 263, though against that an appeal will be filed to the CITA, there will not be an appeal directly to the tribunal. But can one approach the tribunal directly for stay on that? Well, the answer is yes. There have been several cases decided on this ground that this entire demand arises because of the 263. It is because of the direction of the 263 that the assessing officer has raised a demand in the 143 and 263. So similar analogy can be applied not only to such cases of 263 but also typically in many cases now where we see that registrations have been cancelled in 12A. In fact, there is a reported decision in the case of MADA where the Mumbai Tribunal had granted full stay to MADA. I'll just skip this. Coming to some practical tips. Now, I don't know whether these are practical or impractical, but I think some of the things which one needs to keep in mind. The first and the most important thing, I'll come to the second thing first, is written submission and appeal charts. I think I really cannot impress written submission anything further. The reason is very simple. When you file a written submission, you are putting in the submission everything that you want to say on the subject, not only your legal arguments but also your factual arguments. And the reason why it is more so important is because, unlike the tribunal, see, the tribunal, once it hears your case in the morning, in the afternoon the members will start dictating the order. The commercial appeals, the CITA will hear your appeal today, probably adjourn it, hear it later, and then we are all aware, if we receive the order within a month or so, then probably we should consider ourselves slightly fortunate. But by that time, what you have argued, the points that you tried to make, and eventually what he's going to recollect or remember is anybody's guess. So I think written submissions are very important. In fact, some of the leading decisions also, I think in the Vodafone case, it is a matter of record that the court itself has recorded that detailed written submissions have been made by both the parties. So there also we are talking about at the level of High Court or Supreme Court that the courts had requested for written submissions from both the parties. Secondly, as far as appeal charts are concerned, I think we are all aware about what is an appeal chart. Once we file a compilation, we give a simple a chart which gives the ground numbers, what are the grounds, in brief what is the ground of appeal, what is the relevant para and portion of the assessing officer's order and the commissioner appeals order, and against that, in a single line, what we want to state and the page number of the compilation. Now that is very important, and in fact I am talking from an incident which just took place 2 weeks back. We were before the tribunal. Though there were only 6 grounds of appeal, yet the first question which the tribunal member asked us is that, have you prepared an appeal chart? And the appeal chart was not there, and the tribunal requested that we are adjourning this by a week's time, please give us an appeal chart. And just state that you are there to assist us in preparing an order. So therefore, we would request you, to give us this. So the second point is really maintaining proceeding sheets and the record of the discussions which took place in each of the hearing. Now here also, it's important for all of us to keep a separate recording of the proceeding sheets, including the date of the hearing, who attended, what was filed, what was the additional information that was called for, what is the next date of the hearing. And in fact, there have been quite a few rulings, and for quite a few cases also. Before the DRP also, we also came across a live case where in the assessment order, the SSE has written that in spite of so and so reminders, the SSE was not attending or did not file these details called for. So besides, making a point before the tribunal or the DRP that you see this all has been filed, but also to substantiate that we have in fact attended, we can give a copy of our own proceeding sheet. Then the burden of proof shifts to the department. Then it is for the department to say that no, what has been submitted by the SSE is not correct. But there have been quite a few rulings also that the proceeding sheets that have been maintained by the SSE cannot be ignored altogether. So that's an important point of defense for all of us, which we need to keep in mind. We actually had a case out in the case of a condonation of delay in a matter in 263 again, where because of various emails which were exchanged, we were able to show copies of the emails and ask for condonation of delay. This was the case where a non-resident was advised by an Indian, by his representative in India, that there is no need to file an appeal against the 263 to the tribunal. As long as you file an appeal against the 143/263, that would suffice. So when we file a late appeal against the 263 and we file a petition for condonation of delay, we actually attached along with that copies of emails exchanged between the client and the representative in India. And through that we were able to convince, and a delay of over 2.5 years was condoned by the tribunal only on the basis of copies of these emails. So I think intimating the client and all those other points we are well aware of. Now some other tips is, I think of course returns, deposit documents to be thoroughly checked before filing to ensure that there is no contradiction. It's not that in a letter we are saying that we are not claimed this as a deduction under 43B, but later on we file that it has been by mistake added back in the computation of income or not claimed. Also, notices communications from the department should be promptly replied to. I think we should all know by now that what needs to be personally handed over and discussed with the assessing officer and what needs to be filed in a tapa. What we would not like to unnecessarily meet the assessing officer for. And also in certain cases, as to keeping records if the AO is not present, and records to be maintained in the file, or typically if the assessing officer has got an adversarial attitude, then all oral submissions should be reproduced in writing, because This again has really come to our rescue in a lot of cases, because when they have an adversarial attitude, they are going to write anything that they may want to in the order. It will be very difficult to sort of defend it at a higher authority if there is no written evidence of what has been there as a fight. The last thing which I would like to point out here is this era of e-filing of returns. See, earlier things were pretty smooth. When we were filing hard copies, all of us were aware that when you file a computation and a hard copy of the return, you normally used to file a note along with the return. Now, today the era of e-filing of returns, if we have taken a lot of positions, if we have claimed deduction based on various assumptions, etc., then in the absence of any hard filing, there could be issues regarding penalty. So, what one needs to keep in mind is that if we have taken any specific aggressive stance or positions, after we upload the return, we can immediately file a letter with the department, saying to the effect that we have uploaded this return and our computation of income or taxable income has been computed on the following basis. And then we state clearly what are the reasons. Apart from being also helping us for penalty, because clearly penalty cannot be levied when there has been full disclosure. Of late also we've been seeing a lot of decisions on reopening. You see, today we are all aware reopening under 148 generally if intimation has been sent under 143(1), then the department normally has a stronger case. But of late there have been a lot of decisions that have been coming on reopening also, that even under a reopening under 143(1), there yet has to be a reason to believe. And I think several Mumbai Tribunal rulings, Letra Airlines, Indatratha, Gujarat High Court, Delhi High Court also in the case of Mohan Gupta have taken a view that you see, if these things have been disclosed in the computation and in various other statements filed, there was no new material which had come to the assessing officer, and therefore a reopening, even in the case of 143(1), did not have any legs to stand on. So these are purely defenses that we need to just keep in mind.
Just Melinda, so now Form 3CB also we know, this is the next session, right? So that we know since last year, that is March 13, that also required to file electronically, e-filing the Form 3CB. So that becomes very difficult, very necessary that we file a hard copy also for Form 3CB. And so far, it is department has not refused, and I think they can't refuse because it's my right as a taxpayer. Just by filing doesn't mean that department is accepting, because the e-filing, the way it has been structured, that you can't write, suppose you want to qualify something or you want to add something, there is no space, there is no field, as they say in ITA, information technology. So you can't write anything other than what is the space is given. So it's good to file a hard copy with the department after, of course, you file on the website, on the e-file. That's necessary. And the other point I was saying that there was a whole circular which I don't remember, but department can't, many times practically we know, officers say no, don't file it. If you go, the clerk say nahi, sir ka permission leke aao, I won't accept. But there was a very old circular from CBT that no taxpayer has every right to file whatever he wants. You can't refuse any letter to be filed in Tapal, because you are serving, you are there to serve, and just because I, for example, say refund is due, doesn't mean refund becomes due. But that doesn't prevent me from my filing. So practically I know what Milin is saying, and we know many times it's not easy. But if we act, and if, officer may get sometimes annoyed or otherwise, we can very clearly say, sir, I am doing my duty. My client has instructed me to file in Tapal, and I am filing. And I am handing over, but best will be to hand over a copy to him also. What we are, the same copy which you are filing in Tapal. But there is no harm in, and if he becomes aggressive, we can say, sir, I am doing my duty and you are doing your duty. So there is nothing wrong in my filing in Tapal, and many times it protects us because as Milin says, so order not deliberated, but otherwise they write many things that this was not submitted, the taxpayer did not come. So we have some defense before us if we have filed something in Tapal duly acknowledged. Please, we have to move very quickly. Otherwise, we won't get much time.
Okay, I think the other things are really quite self-explanatory. Practical tips, I think here also these things are quite clear. Personality of the officer, we actually come across cases. Today if an assessing officer was earlier an internal promotee, or if he was from the search and seizure, who is moved on to a different, person with a mentality who has been in search and seizure will go on the basis that every person is guilty till he's proved innocent. So, that's a way, unfortunately, that's a mindset of people. And at the same time, a person who has been probably as a department representative before the tribunal, then if you've got some legal arguments, it's possible that he'll be able to appreciate it better, he may be more receptive to things like this. Practical tips, really, I think,
Just before that, so that was relevant for TPI, that was authorities' perspective, right?
yeah.
From the tax authority. So that was I was saying what the DITs and TPOs are thinking, that it's a big batch. Many times documentation what they get is not as robust as they would have required, and sometimes, many times he says we get a very thick book like act, and whether DTC comes or not, it's still big act, and he says but then you produce, the meat is not very much, you produce section 92, the whole sections of TP 92 to 92 Act, then you produce rules 10A to 10 Act. He says there is no need to, I know I can refer that, but you just, though it becomes so voluminous, there is no need to give all the sections and rules, and so you are not giving me a good functional analysis, you are not giving me how the search process has been carried out. That meat is not there, but all this, it becomes too voluminous, and he says it may be 150 pages, but relevant are 20 pages which I don't get. The others are all repetitive, and it doesn't make. So that's what they do say, like very verbose with no substance, and TP is more factual, as we know. It's not legal. Legal points are of course there, but it's more factual, and facts, we don't give good facts to them, it will harm us more, the taxpayer more, because everything is dependent on facts. When facts are not properly given, it harms, and especially in a TP side, for example, suppose I am a service provider, and I don't explain that I am just a service provider, and the main functions or main risk or assets are deployed by my other AE or my group company outside India. Now if I don't bring that out in my report, how it is done, flow of transaction, or how is the whole value chain in the whole transactions, if I don't bring it to TPO or DIT, then they may go in a wrong way, and to some extent we are contributing to that. So the factual part should come very, very clearly before in documentation. And Milind earlier referred High Court, the final finding of fact is tribunal, and High Court refers to only question of law. So far some High Court did decide on TP questions, but we have to be careful. Sometimes department may raise that whether a comparable is right or wrong, there is no question of law. What is the question of law, whether it's a right comparable or not? It's a question of fact, and maybe High Court may not, they may argue that you don't interfere this. And then of course counsel like Milind do argue out that it's a mixed question of law and fact, and push it round, but we don't to reach that stage. So good to get the facts just before TPO as well. Sorry, Milind.
Yeah. Just take another 2-3 minutes. Quickly, really as far as technical preparation is concerned, again, probably we may get an opportunity before the CITA if we are not prepared slightly on some, we got some additional case laws. But before the tribunal, obviously you cannot stand and say, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I've got to, let me get some more time to get more decisions on this, or let me come back to you on this. Certainly that will not be permitted. And case records, discussions with clients, how you want to twist the facts, how you would like to put it, these are very important. Your entire cases could be won and lost. The way in which the entire transaction is explained to the authority and how it is put within the purview of certain case laws. We've actually come across situations where huge expenditure, for example, simple thing where the client had to construct a pipeline, replace a new pipeline with a existing pipeline with a new pipeline. So the question is this capital expenditure?